He posted for a ranch cook at noon. A single widow with children answered the notice. New Mexico Territory, 1,889. The sun stood directly overhead, burning down on the dusty plains like a brand against hide. The wind stirred only dust and dry grass, leaving silence in its wake. On the edge of the wide and cracked earth, where mesquite bushes tangled with barbed wire, a ranch house sat weather-worn but proud, much like the man who lived within it. Colter Vane stood on the front porch of his ranch, arms folded, gaze narrowed toward the distant hills. His face was weathered, the color of tanned leather, with lines etched not just by sun but by sorrow. At 35, Colter had outlived the woman who once braided her hair on that very porch, the woman who had died in a crossfire meant for outlaws. Since then, the ranch had been quiet, too quiet. Pinned to the post beside the front gate, flapping in the breeze, was a single sheet of paper. The writing was clear, plain and without embellishment. Hiring, ranch cook, meals for one, room provided. Must be moral, competent, and able to stay on property. It had been there since noon. By 1 o'clock he had nearly forgotten about it, until he heard the slow crunch of footsteps on gravel. He looked up. A woman stood at the gate, her dress sun-faded but clean, boots coated in travel dust, dark auburn hair pinned up under a bonnet, strands falling loose from the long journey. In one arm she held a small child who clung to her shoulder with a thumb in his mouth. With her other hand she guided a boy, maybe 6, his knuckles white around a thin strap of the family's only suitcase. A third child, a girl no older than 10, walked behind them, dragging a sack that looked like it had survived fire, flood, and years of wear. Colter descended the steps slowly, his boot heels hitting the dry earth. The woman did not smile. Her eyes, green as a prairie storm, met his with something closer to challenge than fear. Dust clung to her lashes. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "You posted for a ranch cook." Colter nodded once. "I'm a cook," she continued. "Also a mother, and I've got no place else to go." She didn't flinch when she said it, and she didn't lower her gaze. Colter looked at the children. 3 stared up at him in silence, their eyes sunken, but alert. He saw their hunger, their quiet. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he stepped aside, his voice low. "Come inside, we'll talk over coffee." The woman nodded once, grateful but not desperate. She walked past him into the house without asking his name, and he, for the first time in years, closed the door behind someone other than himself. Colter Vane was a man of few words and fewer guests. This morning, when Willa Hartley stepped out onto the porch with her 3 children and began gathering eggs from the hens like she had lived there for years, Colter just watched from the barn. He did not ask her to stay, but he didn't ask her to leave either. He gave her 3 days. Just 3. Enough to see if she could cook and keep to herself. By sundown on the first day, the kitchen smelled of fresh bread, beans with smoked pork, and cornbread so light it crumbled between the fingers. She didn't ask where anything was. She found it. She didn't need help with the stove. She'd stoked older one. Her hands worked with the quiet rhythm of someone who had cooked through grief before. The children were quiet, but not strange. The oldest, a girl named Lark, swept the floor with care. The middle child, Silas, helped Colter carry water without a word of complaint. "Baby," Boone hardly cried. They obeyed their mother with the kind of watchfulness that came from long travel and hard lessons. That night, over supper, Colter finally asked her name. "Willa Hartley," she said. Her voice was low but firm. He nodded. "Long since your husband passed." There was a pause before she answered. 3 years, shot in a border raid near El Paso. Wrong place, wrong flag. Colter didn't ask more. He understood too well how bullets didn't care for timing or names. The next morning, he rode into town for supplies. The general store was crowded with dust and voices, and it didn't take long for news to spread. "You hear Colter's got a woman and 3 young'uns up at his place?" Someone whispered behind a barrel of oats. "She's no kin," said another. "No ring. And no shame, apparently." Colter ignored it. Used to being talked about. But that didn't mean he liked it. Later that week, Willa took Lark into town for cloth and thread. She paid with coins wrapped in fabric, and she didn't look anyone in the eye. Anne leaned against the saloon rail, chewing a matchstick. His vest was unbuttoned, and his eyes were too slow to blink. "Lady like you don't belong out here," he muttered. "Shouldn't be raising kids around a man like Vane. Folks don't forget what he's done." Willa stepped around him, saying nothing. He reached to grab her arm. "I said." The man's words stopped. Coulter had appeared without a sound. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He only looked at the man, then let his hand drift, slowly, deliberately, to rest on the worn leather of his gun belt. "Buying thread," Coulter said, voice calm. "You looking to stop that?" The man's bravado shrank like a puddle in Sunday. He stepped back, hands raised. "Didn't mean nothing, Vane, just talking." Coulter didn't blink. "Then talk less." Willa stood still beside him, her eyes unreadable. "Didn't thank him. Didn't need to." They walked back to the wagon in silence. That night, as Coulter lit his lantern, he glanced toward the bunkhouse where the children were already sleeping. Willa stood near the stove, mending a torn hem by firelight. He realized he still didn't know why she looked over her shoulder so often, but for now, she cooked his meals, kept his house, and asked for nothing. And for the first time in years, the ranch felt less like a memory, and more like a place still breathing. The wind had died down by nightfall. The ranch lay still, caught in that rare hush between the calls of coyotes and the creak of dry timber settling into darkness. A fire cracked gently in the hearth inside, casting a soft amber glow across the windows, while outside the stars had come out in clusters, sharp and wide across the endless black sky, like pinpricks through velvet. He sat on the porch with a tin cup of coffee cooling in his hand, his boots propped on the railing. His body still ached from the day's labor, from years of holding too much in, but in that moment, the ache was more background than burden. The scent of sagebrush and wood smoke hung in the air, grounding and familiar. The screen door creaked open behind him. Willa stepped out quietly, arms folded, a shawl draped over her shoulders. The light from the house caught in her hair, setting off a faint auburn shimmer. She didn't ask to join him, simply lowered herself onto the step beside him, her knees drawn up like a girl's, and stared out past the corral, where the horses stood still like shadows, muscles calm, heads low. For a while, neither said a word. It was not silence born of discomfort, something else, like two people standing beside the same grave, aware of what was buried between them but unwilling to disturb it just yet. Then she spoke, not looking at him. "I was born in Garland County, Arkansas." Her voice was even, but there was something held tight beneath it. Coulter didn't interrupt. He didn't nod or prompt her. He simply waited. "My daddy died early. Railroad accident. My mama took in laundry after that, boiled rags and scrubbed until her fingers bled through winter water. She never once complained. She got quieter every year." Willa's hands folded in her lap. She rubbed her thumb over the edge of the shawl. "I married the first boy who didn't talk down to me. Thought that made him a good man." Her voice dulled, like someone reading off an old ledger, tired of the entries but obligated to record them. Hartley. That was his name. He was never mean, just scared of everything. Scared of failure, scared of silence, scared of his own kids sometimes. He drank too much, but he kept food on the table, most days. She paused then, a beat longer. They drafted him to fight in the border war. He ran, got caught, shot by his own unit before he made it a mile from camp. Coulter exhaled slowly through his nose. His grip on the tin cup tightened. "After that," she continued, voice thinner now, "his family said I brought him shame, told me to leave. They said a real wife would have stopped him. 3 mouths to feed, and nowhere to go. Took whatever work I could find." Coulter turned his head slightly, his gaze on the horizon. The sky above them shimmered with stars, scattered like spilled salt across coal. "A job cooking at a saloon, Miss Clarabelle's. Place had girls, sure, but I wasn't one of 'em. Didn't matter. Rumors travel faster than facts." She drew her knees up tighter, resting her chin on them. "Men thought they could treat me like the rest. And women, well, they wouldn't look me in the eye. I saved what I could, kept my head down. Then the fire came." Coulter's brow furrowed. "What fire?" "Someone knocked over a lamp during a fight. Whole back side of the place went up like paper. Lost everything I had. Almost lost Lark, too. She got trapped behind a door that jammed. And with just the clothes we wore. and what little I had tied up in a flour sack. Her voice turned quieter, softer than the breeze. That's when I saw your notice. Prayed you wouldn't ask too many questions. She finally looked at him. Her face was calm, but her eyes, God, her eyes were worn down by years no one had seen, like a riverbed after drought. Coulter set down his cup and reached into his coat pocket. Without a word, he pulled out a handkerchief, faded cream with pale blue stitching at the edge, and handed it to her. She blinked, not understanding. Was my wife's, he said. She would have liked you. Willa stared at it for a long second, then reached out and took it gently, like it might break. She did not cry. Held it in both hands like something sacred. They sat that way for a while, the night drawing in around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped and then fell silent. The wind held still. Stars above fell silent too, until one streaked across the sky without warning, a brief, golden scar across the black. Neither made a wish. Some things, after all, were already in motion. The days stretched long under the high desert Sunday. The land, rough and wide, offered no rest to those who worked it, and Coulter Vane made no exceptions. From dawn till near dark, he was in the saddle or on his feet, checking fences, tending cattle, driving off coyotes. There was always something that needed mending. The children fell into rhythm faster than anyone expected. Rose early, milked the goats without complaint, and learned how to stack kindling just right to catch flame. Silas helped Coulter mend the chicken pen and even dared to toss feed at the ornery bull with a look of defiance. He toddled after his siblings, too small to work but too stubborn to be left behind. Willa took over the kitchen like it had always been hers. By the second week, Coulter noticed the larder was neater, the preserves were properly sorted, and somehow the bitter taste had vanished from the morning coffee. She never asked him questions, but sometimes, at night, when they passed each other near the fire or in the garden by the pump, their eyes met just a second too long. She looked away first. He always let her. They didn't talk much, but their silences grew comfortable. Came the morning, the sorrel mare broke loose from the paddock. She spooked just after dawn, tearing the rope with a crack of panic and bolting into the open plain. He saddled up without breakfast, barely mumbling a word as he rode off with a rifle slung across his back. The hours passed slow. The sun climbed higher. By afternoon, Willa had walked to the edge of the pasture 5 times, scanning the horizon with her hand to her brow. The kids felt it, too. They kept glancing toward the road, their play quiet, their mouths tight. It was near dusk when Lark shouted from the porch, "Mama, he's back!" Willa ran out, heart in her throat. Coulter's horse limped slightly, and his own posture was wrong, too upright, too stiff. Drew closer, she saw the blood. He slid off the saddle and caught the post to steady himself. "Took one in the side," he muttered. "Bastards were waiting near the canyon ridge. Thought I was alone." Willa caught his arm. "Bleeding through your shirt." "Not deep," he said through gritted teeth. "Just a graze." It wasn't a graze. Inside, she cleared the kitchen table and helped him lower himself onto it. The children stayed silent in the next room, listening. Willa cut through his shirt with her sewing scissors, exposing a long, angry gash just beneath his ribs. The bullet had torn skin and muscle, but missed the bone. Still, it bled steady, dark and thick. Her hands trembled as she poured whiskey over the wound. Coulter didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. "You don't have to. Be still," she whispered. Threaded the needle with practiced fingers, but the first stitch skipped. She tried again. He saw her hands shake. "You done this before?" "No," she admitted, her voice raw. "But I watched it done. Once." Coulter looked at her, biting her lip, brow furrowed, trying not to cry. So he spoke, soft and steady. "You're doing fine." She blinked fast, nodded once, then she stitched. 12 passes. Each one slow. Her fingers brushed his bare skin, warm and sweat-slicked, and each time he resisted the urge to wince, not because it didn't hurt, but because he didn't want her to stop. When she tied off the final thread, her breath hitched. He looked at her, not in pain, but in wonder. She wiped the blood from his side, then paused, her hand still on him. "You could have died," she said softly. Coulter's eyes held hers. "Today." She looked down, her hand still resting over the fresh bandage. "I'm sorry I wasn't better prepared." He shook his head. You were right where I needed you. For a long second, neither moved. Willa stood, wiped her hands, and stepped back. The space between them returned, but it was no longer empty. The storm rolled in fast, too fast for comfort. The sky went from gold to steel in minutes, and the first crack of thunder split the evening just as Coulter was finishing the last fence check. He urged his horse back to the barn as the wind kicked up dust in thick, spinning gusts. Rain followed hard behind, pelting the earth in heavy sheets. Willa had already ushered the children inside when Coulter made it to the porch. She opened the door just as he stepped up. "One's mean," she said. Her voice was calm, but her eyes flicked toward the horizon, like something's trying to rip the sky in half. "It might," Coulter replied. "I need to check the livestock. Horses will panic if the wind hits from the west." He didn't wait for argument, just grabbed his coat and turned toward the barn. The rain had turned the ground slick by the time he reached the paddock. Lightning split the sky again, and the horses were already kicking and rearing inside the barn, nostrils wide, eyes wild. He stepped inside just as the wind slammed the doors shut behind him. A crack echoed above. The old beams, the ones he had meant to replace next month, groaned like something alive. And then he heard it. A cry, high, small, terrified. "Silas?" he called out. A flash of lightning lit up the far stall, and there, huddled behind a half-collapsed trough, was the boy, soaked through, shaking, his tiny hands covering his head. Coulter's chest seized, plunged forward, dodging a spooked mare, shoving through falling hay and loose boards. The ceiling above creaked again, a high, screaming sound like something tearing loose from the heavens. He didn't hesitate. He threw himself over the boy just as the beam came down. The crack was loud. Pain, instant. The wood slammed against Coulter's shoulder, pinning him halfway to the ground. He could feel the snap. Not a breakthrough, but deep enough to burn like fire. Still, he kept his arms locked around Silas. "You all right?" he whispered through gritted teeth. The boy was crying, but he nodded. Shifted, pushing the beam with his free arm. It took 3 tries, teeth clenched hard, before it gave just enough for him to drag them both free. Time he stumbled from the barn, Willa was running toward them barefoot through the mud, rain soaking her to the skin. She fell to her knees in front of them. "Silas! Oh, God!" She scooped the boy into her arms. He clung to her, sobbing. She looked up at Coulter. He was pale, lips drawn tight, cradling his arm. "You're hurt." He shrugged with one shoulder, eyes already dimming. "Nothing I haven't earned." She reached up, touched his cheek, her hand trembling. "You didn't have to go in there." He looked down at Silas, then back at her. "Yes, I did." Word traveled fast. Morning, the storm had passed, but half the town had heard what Coulter Vane had done. Some came by the ranch, under the guise of checking fences or offering new lumber, but their eyes all strayed to the boy and to the man in the sling. Woman, the preacher's wife, whispered to another outside the general store, "That child could have died. He's not even his blood." The other woman nodded, eyes glassy. "No," but Coulter held him like he was. For the first time in a long while, the gossip quieted, and in its place, something else began to take root. The days that followed were quieter, not because there was less to do, but because something had shifted between them. After the storm, after the barn, after Coulter had carried Silas out with a broken shoulder and a clenched jaw, the silence no longer held distance. Something else. Coulter moved slower now, his arm bound in a sling, the pain waking him in the night and keeping him at the edge of sleep. Willa took over most of the chores without asking. He didn't fuss or hover, but he could feel her presence in everything, from the way the tools were laid out on the bench to the warm towel folded on the porch railing each morning. One evening, as the last light dipped behind the hills, Coulter sat near the fire and began to speak, not out of obligation, but because the quiet between them had earned the truth. "My wife's name was May." His voice was low, rough. Willa looked up from her stitching but said nothing. She had a stubborn streak. Used to argue with me about fence posts and feed schedules, like she ran the place. He smiled faintly. She did." Willa set her needle down. "We didn't get to have kids. Tried for years. Lost 2. After the last one, she just got quiet. He stared into the flames. That's why she stood in the doorway that night, when the shooting started. Like she didn't care anymore what happened to her, like maybe part of her already. He didn't finish. Willa rose, walked into the kitchen, and returned a few minutes later carrying a pie dish, still warm, the scent of cinnamon and roasted squash wafting into the room. Pumpkin pie. She placed it on the table between them and handed him a fork. No words, no explanation. He looked at it, then at her. His eyes softened. She made it like that, he said. Every harvest. Willa gave a small nod. Still, she said nothing. That night, when the house had gone dark and the children were asleep, Coulter stepped into the barn. His shoulder throbbed, but he managed to reach the old saddle May had used on her mare, the one he hadn't touched in years. A knife from his pocket. Slowly, carefully, he began to carve. Lark, Silas, Boone, each name etched into the worn leather beneath the horn. It wasn't for show. He didn't even light a lamp. He did it because they belonged here. Because he wanted them to. The next morning, Willa came to the barn to fetch a pail. She saw the saddle, saw the names. She didn't call out to him, didn't touch the leather or ask why. But as she turned away, she pressed the back of her hand to her cheek, just once, and wiped away the tears that had already begun to fall. Just past noon when the rider appeared, dust trailing behind him like smoke, coat flapping loose against the heat. Coulter was working in the north pasture, sling removed for the lighter tasks, when the figure came into view. And rode like he owned the trail, eyes shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, chin high, posture sharp. By the time Coulter reached the yard, Willa was already on the porch, Lark clinging silently behind her. The rider dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with deliberate weight. He looked at Willa and smiled, an expression that did not reach his eyes. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Didn't expect you'd land on your feet so fast, darlin'." Willa's face drained of color. "Evan?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Coulter stepped between them. "You know this man?" She didn't answer. Tipped his hat. "Name's Evan Hartley. And that there's my wife." The words hit like a whip crack. Willa's breath caught. "That's a lie." Evan's smile turned to stone. "We never signed no papers, no annulment, no declaration of death. I left to fight. I came back. Was gone." Coulter stared hard at him. "She said you were dead," Evan snorted. "Maybe she wanted me that way." Word spread like wildfire. By dusk, the town was buzzing. A widow, now not so widowed. Children born in sin. A man of God being deceived. Rumors turned into whispers, whispers into shouts. The next morning, Willa was confronted outside the store by 3 women with pursed lips and judgment in their eyes. "You brought shame to this town. Living with a man like you were married. Lying to our children, to our pastor." Lark watched from behind the cart, her small fists clenched. Stood tall, but her voice shook. "I thought he was dead. I buried him in my mind a long time ago." "That's not how the law works," one woman hissed. "You need to leave, before your sin poisons more." Coulter didn't argue. Shout. Instead, he rode straight to the pastor's home and banged once on the door. The reverend opened with furrowed brow. "Mr. Vane?" "I need church records," Coulter said flatly. "Evan Hartley. Service record. Next of kin. I want proof." The pastor hesitated. "That's not—" Coulter's voice lowered. "She has nowhere else to go, and I won't let lies steal what she's built." By nightfall, the truth came in a thin, folded letter from the county registrar. Evan Hartley had indeed enlisted. But he wasn't Willa's husband. He was Eli Hartley's brother. Willa's real husband, had died, as she claimed, buried under a different name after a skirmish near the border. Evan had returned months later, bitter, broke, and ready to manipulate whatever he could to get his hands on something, land, money, or power. He walked into the saloon where Evan was already drinking on someone else's dime. The room fell silent. Coulter didn't draw his gun. He didn't raise his voice. He just walked to the center of the room and said loud enough for all to hear, "You lied to this town. You called a mother a whore. You called a widow a wife. And you'll get on your horse now, or I'll put you under it." Evan laughed once, until he saw Coulter's hand resting near the buckle of his belt. He left. No one stopped him. Next morning, Coulter hitched his wagon, tied the saddlebags tight, and brought the family's things out to the porch. Willa stepped outside, confused. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer, just kept loading. A small crowd began to form near the gate, townsfolk with uncertain expressions. Coulter turned to face them. He wasn't angry, just tired, and full of something deeper. "You made it clear," he said. "You don't want them here, and I don't keep what the land don't welcome." He walked to Willa, met her gaze. "But if they leave, I leave with them." The wind stirred. No one spoke, and that silence was the beginning of something else entirely. The days after Evan Hartley's departure passed, with the quiet weight of reckoning. No more accusations came. No more whispers trailed behind Willa in the market. The storm had spent itself, and what remained was something softer. Others began stopping by, not with judgment, but with pies, tools, sacks of seed. Someone mended the church bench Willa used on Sundays. A widow down the lane offered to watch the children while she worked. Silas cut his hand on a rusty nail. The blacksmith's wife brought over bandages and stayed until nightfall. They had seen what Coulter had done. For a boy, not his blood. They had seen how Willa stood tall while being shamed, how her children spoke gently and worked harder than most grown men. It didn't erase the past, but it changed something in the marrow of the town. One evening, as the sky bled orange and gold, Coulter walked out to the garden where Willa was pulling carrots. He watched her for a long moment before speaking. "Been thinking." She looked up, brushing dirt from her palms. "About what?" He swallowed, his voice rough. "About offering you something. More." Her eyes searched his. "You've already given us everything." He shook his head. "Not everything." He took a slow breath. "Willa, She raised her hand. "Don't." He froze. She stepped closer, her voice low. "Coulter, I love this place. I love what you've done for my children, what you've done for me. But I won't let you take on my scars just because you think you have to." His jaw tightened. "It's not obligation." "I know," she said gently. "But I need to stand on my own 2 feet first. I need to know that I chose love, not safety." He nodded slowly, hurt flickering in his eyes, but respect stronger still. They said nothing else that. 2 weeks later, Willa woke to the scent of roasting pork, baking apples, and fresh-cut dill. Outside, lanterns hung from fence posts, long tables stretched across the yard, dozens of chairs, borrowed from neighbors. The church, even the schoolhouse, sat in rows. Lark was tying ribbons to the porch rail. Silas had his boots polished. Had a flower tucked behind his ear. Coulter stood in the center of it all, sleeves rolled, his arm long out of its sling. By sundown, the yard was filled with laughter and voices, the clinking of plates, the hum of fiddle strings played by the old ranch hand down the road. Willa moved among them, pouring coffee, offering slices of pie, her apron dusted with flour and joy. As the last dish was cleared and twilight fell in slow, golden layers, Coulter walked to the center of the yard. The talking quieted. He turned to Willa. He didn't kneel. He didn't hold out a ring. He sat down on the bench beside her, folded his hands and said, "Mrs. Vane, if you ever thought about cooking for someone for the rest of your life,